Woods Runner by Gary Paulsen. Chapter 1. He was not sure exactly when he became a child of the forest. One day it seemed he was 11 and playing in the dirt around the cabin or helping with chores, and the next, he was 13, carrying a .40 caliber Pennsylvania flintlock rifle, wearing smoked buckskin clothing and moccasins, moving through the woods like a knife through water while he tracked deer to bring home to the cabin for meat. He sat now by a game trail waiting for the deer he knew would come soon. He had heard it, a branch brushing a hairy side, a twig cracking, smelled it when the wind blew toward him, the musk and urine of a buck. He checked the priming on his rifle while he waited, his mind and body relaxed, patient, ears and eyes and nose alert. Quiet. Every part of him at rest, yet focused and intense. And he pictured his life, how he lived in two worlds. Sometimes Samuel thought that a line dividing those worlds went right through their cabin. To the west, beyond the small parchment window made of grease-soaked sheepskin scraped paper thin, lay the forest. The forest was unimaginably vast, impenetrable, mysterious, and dark. His father had told him that a man could walk west for a month, walk as fast as he could, and never see the sun, so high and dense was the canopy of leaves. Even close to their homestead, 12 acres clawed out of the timber with a small log cabin and a lean-to for a barn, the forest was so thick that in the summer Samuel could not see more than 10 or 15 yards into it. Some oak and elm and maple trees were 4 and 5 feet in diameter and so tall and thickly foliaged their height could only be guessed. A wild world. And while there were trails made by game and sometimes used by natives, settlers or trappers, the paths wandered and meandered so that they were impossible to use in any sensible way. Except to hunt. When he first started going into the forest, Samuel went only a short distance. That first time, though he was well armed with his light Pennsylvania rifle and dry powder and a good knife, he instantly felt that he was in an alien world. As a human he did not belong. It was a world that did not care about man any more than it cared about dirt, or grass, or leaves. He did not get lost that first time, because he'd marked trees with his knife as he walked so he could find his way out, but still, in some way he felt lost, as if, were he not careful, a part of him would disappear and never return, gone to the wilderness. Samuel had heard stories of that happening to some men. They entered the forest to hunt or trap or look for new land to settle and simply vanished. Gone to the woods, people said of them. Some, he knew, were dead. Killed by accident, or panthers, or bear, or Indians. He had seen such bodies. One, a man mauled to death by a bear that had attacked his horse while the man was plowing, the man's head was eaten. Another, killed by an arrow through the throat. An arrow, Samuel knew, that came out of the woods from a bough that was never seen, shot by a man who was never known. And when he was small, safe inside the cabin near the mud brick fireplace with his mother and father, he had heard the panthers scream. They sounded like a woman gone mad. Oh, he knew the forest could kill. Once, sitting by the fire, a distant relative, a shirt-tail uncle who was a very old man of nearly 50 named Ishmael, had looked over his shoulder as if expecting to see monsters and said, "Nothing dies of old age in the forest. Not bugs, not deer, not bear nor panthers nor man. Live long enough, be slow enough, get old enough and something eats you. Everything kills." And yet Samuel loved the forest now. He knew the sounds and smells and images like he knew his own mind, his own yard. Each time he had entered he'd gone farther, learned more, marked more trees with his knife, until he always knew where he was. Now he thought of the DEP forest as his home, as much as their cabin. But some men vanished for other reasons, too. Because the forest pulled them and the wild would not let them go. 3 years ago, when Samuel was 10, he had seen one of these men, a man who moved like smoke, his rifle a part of his arm, a tomahawk through his belt next to a slab-bladed knife, eyes that saw all things, ears that heard all things. One family in the settlement had a room on their cabin that was a kind of store. The man had come to the store to buy small bits of cloth and powder and English flints for his rifle at the same time Samuel was waiting for his mother to buy thread. The man smelled of deep forest, of smoke and blood and grease and something green. Samuel knew he smelled that way, too. The stranger could not be still. As he stood waiting, he moved. Though he was courteous and nodded to people, as soon as he had the supplies for his rifle and some salt, he left. He was there one moment and gone the next, into the trees, gliding on soft moccasins to become part of the forest, as much as any tree or leaf or animal. He went west. Away from man, away from the buildings and the set. Now Samuel heard a new sound. He moved his eyes slowly to the left without turning his head and was rewarded by seeing a tick-infested rabbit sitting by a tree trying to clear the insects out of his ears. Samuel smiled. Even in dead of winter the rabbits were always trying to rid themselves of the pests. The sight made him think of his mother, who was intensely curious and had once asked him to take her into the forest. They had not gone far, not over 500 yards from the edge of the clearing, and had stopped under a towering oak where sunlight could not get through. There was a subdued green light over everything. Even their faces looked a gentle green. "I have to go back," she said, her eyes wide, wrapping a shawl tightly around her shoulders, though it was summer warm. "This is too thick. Even the air is green. So thick it feels like it could be cut. I have to go back now." Although Samuel's parents lived in the wilderness, they were not a part of it. They had been raised in towns and had been educated in schools where they'd been taught to read and write and play musical instruments. They moved west when Samuel was a baby, so that they could devote themselves to a quiet life of hard physical work and contemplation. They loved the woods, but they did not understand them. Not like Samuel. They had told their son that they didn't belong in towns either. They weren't comfortable in the world of roads, houses, and villages. East of the imaginary line in the cabin was what his father and mother called civilization. They told Samuel about the chaos of towns that they'd escaped. There were noises, hammers clanging at blacksmith forges, chickens clucking, dogs barking, cows lowing, horses whinnying and whickering, people who always seemed to need to be talking to one another. There wasn't noise in the forest. There were smells. Wood smoke filled the air in every season because it wasn't just for heat, but to cook as well, the smell of oak for long fires, pine for short and fast and hot fires. The smell of bread, and sometimes, if they were lucky and had honey or rock sugar to pulverize in a sack with a hammer, sweet pie. The odor of stew cooking in the cast-iron pot over an outside fire or in an iron kettle hung in the fireplace, the scent flying up through the chimney and out over the ground as the wind moved the smoke around. There was the tang of manure, stacked in back of small shed-like barns to age before it was put on gardens, horse and cow and chicken manure from their farm and other farms. So many smells swirled by the same wind throughout the small valley. Their valley was like a huge bowl, nestled in the hills in far western Pennsylvania. Here lived, and had always lived, Samuel Lehi Smith, age 13, with his father, Olin, and his mother, Abigail, parents whom Samuel did not always understand but whom he loved. They read to him about the world beyond from their prized books. All the long winter nights with tallow candles burning while they sat by the fireplace, they read aloud to each other. At first Head listened as they took turns. Later he read to himself and knew the joyous romp of words on paper. He read all the books they had in the cabin and then books from other cabins in the valley so that he could know more and more of a world found only in his imagination and dreams. To the east lay the faraway world of enormous cities and the Great Sea in Europe and ancient Rome and darkest Africa and the mysterious land of the Asias and so many people they couldn't be counted. All kinds of different people with foreign languages and their knowledge of strange worlds. To the east lay polished shoes and ornate clothes and formal manners and enormous wealth. His mother would spin tales for him about cultured men who wore carefully powdered wigs and dipped snuff out of little silver snuff boxes and beautiful women dressed in gowns of silk and satin with swirling petticoats as they danced in the great houses and exclusive salons of London and Paris. Now, the deer stepped out. It stood in complete profile not 30 yards away. Samuel held his breath. He waited for it to turn away, look around in caution. When it did, he raised the rifle and cocked the hammer, pulling it back as quietly as he could, the sear dropping in with a soft snick. The rifle had two triggers, a set trigger that armed a second, front trigger and made it so sensitive that a mere brush released the hammer. He moved his finger from the set trigger and laid it next to but didn't touch the hair trigger. Then he settled the German silver blade of the front sight into the tiny notch of the rear sight and floated the tip of the blade sight until it rested just below the shoulder of the young buck. Directly over its heart. A half second, no, a quarter second passed. Samuel could touch the hair trigger now and the hammer would drop, the flint would scrape the metal frizzen, kicking it out of the way and showering sparks down on the powder in the small pan, which would ignite and blow a hot jet of gas into the touch hole on the side of the barrel of the rifle, setting off the charge, propelling the small .40 caliber ball down the bore. Before the buck heard the sound of the rifle, the ball would pass through the heart and out the other side of the deer, killing it. And yet he did not pull the trigger. He waited. Part of a second, then a full second. And another. The deer turned, saw him standing there. With a convulsive explosion of muscle, it jumped straight in the air. It landed running and disappeared into the trees. The whole time Samuel had not really been thinking of the deer, but what lay east. Of what they called civilization. He eased the hammer of the rifle down to the first notch on the sear, a safety position, and lowered the weapon. Oddly, he wasn't disappointed that had not taken the deer, though the fresh meat would have been nice roasted over the hearth. Had killed plenty of deer, sometimes 10 or 15 a day, so many they could not possibly eat all the meat. He often shot them because the deer raided the cornfields and had to be killed to save the crops. Most families did not like deer meat anyway. They considered it stringy and tough and it was often wormy. The preferred meat was bear or beaver, which were richer and less cordy. This deer would have been nice. They had not had fresh meat in nearly 2 weeks. But it was gone now. He could not stop his wondering about what lay to the east. The world. It was supposed to be a better place than the frontier, with a more sensible way to live. And yet he had just learned an ugly truth about that world only the evening before. Those people in the world who were supposed to be civilized, full of knowledge and wisdom and graciousness and wealth and education, were caught in the madness of vicious, bloody war. It did not make any sense. Samuel started trotting back toward the cabin in an easy shuffle walk that moved him quietly and at some speed without wearing out his moccasins. He was lucky to get a month prepared before they wore through at the heels. He moved without a great deal of effort, his eyes and ears missing very little as he almost flowed through the forest. But his mind was still on the man who had brought the sheet of paper the night before. Communication. In the year 1776, the fastest form of travel for any distance over 30 or 40 miles was by ship. With steady wind, a sailing vessel could clock 100 to 200 miles a day for weeks on end. A horse could cover 30, maybe even 40, miles a day, although not for an extended period without breaking down. At best, coaches could do 100 miles in a 24-hour day by changing horses every 10 or 15 miles, but only if the roads were in good shape, which they almost never were. A man could walk 20 or 30 miles a day faster for short periods, but always depending on conditions of land, weather and footgear. 15 miles a day was standard. So there was no fast and dependable way to transmit information in those years. No telegraph, no telephone, no internet, no texting, no overnight delivery services. It might take 5 or 6 days for knowledge of an important event to move just 10 miles, carried by a traveler on foot. Settlements were 12 to 15 miles apart. And information was carried by hand from person to person on paper or, in most cases, shared by word of mouth. Chapter 2. Samuel had returned home from the forest the night before and found his parents sipping tea with Isaac, an old man of the forest who stopped by their cabin every few months while he was hunting. This time, though, he had news. He carried information about a fight in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, where militia had fired on and defeated British soldiers. The battle had happened months before, all the way back in April of 1775. Isaac seemed to be made entirely of scraps of old leather and rags. He was bald and wore a ratty cap with patches of fur that had been worn away. He was tall and thin and for many years had lived in a cabin some 20 miles to the east. He was so much a part of the forest that even his brief visits with Samuel's family caused him discomfort. Had decided to move farther into the frontier when a wagon, pulled by oxen, came into the clearing near his cabin. The family was traveling westward, looking for a piece of land to farm, and had chosen a spot not far from Isaac's place. The family was, Isaac said, a crowd. And I knew it was time to move on, seeing as how I don't do particular good with crowds of people. As he was taking his leave from the small shack where he had lived, the family had given him the scrap of paper, soft with wear from all the hands it had passed through, so he could share the news with fellow travelers he met on his journey. They told him of other events they had heard of along the way. He tried to remember the details, but admitted that he wasn't much for conversation. Since there was so much noise from the sprats, as it seemed a dozen of them, my thinker fuzzed up like bad powder and my recollector might not be all it could be, but I think they said there was another fight at a place called Bunker Hill and the Patriot militia got whipped there and sent running when they saw the bayonets on the British soldiers' muskets. He sat, quietly sipping the evergreen tea he always carried, a brew made from pine and spruce needles. He swore it cured colds, and he said he preferred it over foreigner tea from outside, but thank ye, missus. The paper he'd handed to Samuel's father, Olin, was a single sheet that had been folded and unfolded so many times it was near to falling apart. It had been printed on a crude press with wooden block letters and was smudged and hard to read. But there was a brief description of the fight at Lexington and Concord and a drawing of figures firing muskets at some other figures that were falling to the ground. As Samuel studied the paper in his father's hands, he thought, everything in my world just got bigger. 2 other families, the Clarks and the Overtons, pulled up in wagons. Isaac had spoken to them on his way to Samuel's place and they wanted to hear what Olin had to say about Isaac's news. Samuel looked around the small cabin on the edge of the woods that was suddenly filled with people all talking over each other about the meaning of the battles. It seemed that the strong and sturdy log walls no longer protected his family. The loud outside world his parents had escaped by moving to the frontier had found them. Samuel was excited and frightened and overwhelmed all at the same time. What does it mean? Ebenezer Clark asked Olin. His face was red and round as an apple because he drank home beer, 3 quarts every morning for breakfast. It could be local. Just some trouble in Boston, Samuel's father said. A riot or the like. There's always a chance of rabble-rousing in the cities. And it doesn't seem likely that a group of farmers would try to take on the entire British army. He paused, then added thoughtfully, England has the most powerful army and navy in the world, and a gaggle of farmers would have to be insane to fight them. Likely or not, this from Lund Harris, a soft-spoken and careful man whose wife, Clara, sat nursing an infant. If it happens, we have to think what it means for us out here on the edge. Nobody spoke. Samuel could hear the crackle of the fire in the fireplace. In the homey, safe cabin, the craziness of the information from the east seemed impossible. There was always some measure of violence on the frontier, marauding savages, drunks, thieves, evildoers, men who operated outside the walls of reason. Harshness was to be expected in the wild. But nothing like this, nothing that challenged the established order, the very rule of the crown, the civilized life that came from the English way of living. The very idea of fighting the British was too big to understand, too huge to even contemplate. These settlers had always been loyal to the rules of the land, obedient to the laws of the country that ruled them. Ben Overton stood. He was a tall, thin man whose sleeves never seemed to come to his wrists. He said, "Well, I think we should do nothing but wait and see how the wind blows." And with nods and a few mumbles of affirmation the rest got up and went back to their own homes. Not a single person in that cabin could have known what was coming. And even if they had seen the future, they would not have been able to imagine the horror. Frontier life. The only thing that came easy to people of the frontier was land. A single family could own hundreds, even thousands of acres simply by claiming them. If getting the land was easily accomplished, using the land was a different matter. It had to be cleared of trees for farming. Some oaks were 5 or 6 feet in diameter, and each had to be chopped down by axe, cut into manageable sections and hauled off. Then the stump was dug out of the ground, often with a handmade wooden shovel. One stump might take a week or two of hard work, and a piece of land could have tens of dozens of trees. If a family was lucky, they might find a clearing left by beavers, which log off an area and dam a creek to make a lake, rotting out all the stumps. When the trees and the food are gone, the beavers leave, the dam breaks down, the water drains off, and there is a handy clearing left where the lake was. Chapter 3. The woods were never completely quiet. Even in silence, there would be a whisper, a soft change that told something. If you listened, complete quiet could speak worlds. Samuel had gone 5 ridges away from home, hunting, feeling the woods. Something was off. If not wrong, then different. The woods felt strange, as if something had changed or was about to change. Samuel shrugged off the feeling and kept going. It was hard to measure distance, because the ridges varied in height and width and the forest canopy blocked out the sun. He was hunting bear, so he moved slowly of life. 5 ridges, going in a straight line, might have meant 4 or 5 miles. The wandering path he followed probably covered more like 7 or 8. He had seen no fresh sign until he came halfway up the 5th ridge, a thickly forested round hump shaped like the back of a giant animal. Then he saw fresh bear droppings, still steaming, filled with berry seeds and grass stems, and he slowed his pace through the thick undergrowth until he came to the top of the ridge. To his surprise, the trees were gone, and he could see miles in all directions. He had hunted this direction many times, but had never reached this ridge before. The thick undergrowth in the summer and early fall had kept him from seeing this high point. He was amazed to find that below him on the western side of the ridge lay a small valley perhaps half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide. The graceful chain of round meadows and lush grass was already perfect farmland. The treeless patch just needed rail fencing and a cabin to be complete. Perfect, he said aloud. Like it was made to be used. A crunching noise to his rear, to the east, brought him around. The bear was 40 or so yards away, a yearling, slope-shouldered, dark brown more than black. Like a large dog, it was digging in a rotten stump on the edge of the clearing. Samuel cocked his rifle, raised it and then held. He looked above the bear across the tops of trees. Smoke. Thick clouds of smoke were rising to the east, almost straight to the east, a goodly distance away. Forest fire? But it wasn't that dry, and there had been no thunderstorms, the normal cause of forest fires. Then he remembered that their neighbor Overton was going to burn limbs and brush from trees he had felled and cleared. The direction and distance looked about right for the settlement. The bear moved, stood and looked at him, then dropped and was gone without Samuel's firing. Another missed kill. The smoke was in the right direction and at the probable distance, but there was something wrong with it, the way there had been something wrong with the feel of the woods today. He eased the hammer down on his rifle and lowered the butt to the ground. He stood leaning on it, studying the smoke the way he would read sign from a wounded animal, trying to see the why of it. The gray smudge was wide, not just at the base but as it rose up, too wide for a single pile of slash. That could be explained by wind blowing the smoke around. But it was a still, clear day. All right, he thought, so Overton set fire to the slash and it spread into some grass and that made it wider. But the grass in the settlement area had been grazed to the ground by the livestock and what was left was still green and hard to burn. And would not make a wide smoke. Avu do not make such a dark, wide smoke that it could be seen from, how far? Maybe 8 miles? Smoke that would show that dark and that wide from 8 miles away on a clear, windless day had to be intentional. He frowned, looking at the smoke, willing it to not be what was coming into his mind like a dark snake, a slithering horror. Some kind of attack. No. He shook his head. There had been years of peace. Even with a war, a real war, starting back east in the towns and cities, it would not have come out here so soon. It had only been a week since they'd heard the news. It could not come this soon. But even as he thought this, his mind was calculating. Distance home, 8 miles in thick forest. Time until dark, an hour, hour and a half. No moon, it would be. Hard dark. Could he run 8 miles an hour through the woods in the dark? It would be like running blind. An attack. Had there been an attack on the settlement, on his home? He started running down the side of the ridge. Not a crazy run, but working low and slipping into the game trails, automatically looking for a turn or shift that would take him more directly home. Home. An attack on his home. An attack on his mother and father? And he had not been there to help. Deep breaths, hard, and deep pulls of air as he increased his speed, moccasins slapping the ground, rifle held out in front of him to move limbs out of the way as he loped through the forest. The green thickness that once helped him now seemed to clutch at him, pull him back, hold him. An attack. And he had not been there to protect his parents. Part 2, Red War 1776. Weapons. A single rifle, something every frontier family needed, something that was an absolute necessity, might take a year or more, and a year's wages, to get from one of the rare gunsmiths, located perhaps miles away. This was the only weapon many of the rebels carried into battle against the British. The firearm issued to the British Army was called the Brown Bess musket. It was a smoothbore and fired a round ball of .75 caliber, approximately 3/4 of an inch in diameter, with a black powder charge, ignited by flint, that pushed the ball at 700 or 800 feet per second when it left the muzzle. Modern rifles send the bullet out at just over 3,000 feet per second. Because a round ball fired from a smoothbore is so pitifully inaccurate, the ball bounces off the side of the bore as it progresses down the barrel. The Brown Bess was really only good out to about 50 yards. The ball would vary in flight so widely that it was common for a soldier to aim at one man coming at him and hit another man 4 feet to the left or right. With the Brown Bess, each British soldier was issued a bayonet, nearly 3 feet long, that twist-locked to the end of the barrel and turned the empty weapon into a kind of attacking pike. Along with personal weapons, the British Army employed artillery, small field cannon, which fired plain round balls, exploding shells and grape shot, scores of round musket balls packed down the bore to make the cannon into something like a giant shotgun. Grape shot was so viciously effective against columns of marching men that its destruction would not be duplicated until the use of the rapid-fire machine gun in the First World War. Whole ranks of attacking men could be torn to pieces in a single shot, the musket ball passing through man after man, ripping them apart. Chapter 4. Samuel smelled it before he saw anything. Not just the smoke from the fires, but the thick, heavy smell. Blood. Death. No. The single word took over his brain. Part of his thinking was automatic, leading him to act with caution, move with stealth. But the front part, the thinking part, hung on one word: no. Head made good time, running hard until his lungs seemed to be on fire, then jogging until he got his breath, then back to the full-out run. There was probably another half hour of daylight before it was too dark to see. As he approached the settlement, he slowed and moved off to the side. It would do no good to run head-on if the attackers were still there. He was silent, listening keenly. Surely if anyone was ill there they would make some noise. All Samuel heard was the crackling of fire, the soft nice sounds of evening birds. No human sound. At the edge of the clearing near his home he paused, frightened, no, terrified at what he would find. He was hidden in some branches and he studied the area through the leaves to make sure it was clear before he stepped out. The cabin was gone. Burned to the ground, side shed and all. Here and there an ember flickered and crackled and smoke rose into the evening sky, but the building was no more. In the distance he could see that the other cabins, scattered through the clearing, had been burned as well. Dreading what he might find, he forced himself to search the ashes, looking for the slightest indication of bodies. He could not bring himself to think about what he was really looking for, his parents. His brain would not allow it, though he knew the death smell came from someone. He could not allow himself to believe it was from them, from mother and father. He found nothing in the ashes. And when he spread the search out around the cabin, moving in greater circles, he still found no trace that might have been his parents. But as the search loop widened, he began to come across bodies his neighbors, shot down and hacked where they'd fallen. They did not look like they had been people. What he found seemed more like trash, paper and cloth blown across the ground. But they were people, friends and families he had known. A frantic need took him, the thought that the next body might be the one he dreaded most to find, and he ran from one to another trying to identify them in the failing light. Most had been mutilated so badly it was hard to tell who they had once been. Overton lay by his cabin, his shirt sleeves still knot down on his wrists, chest and stomach filled with arrows, his scalp gone so his face drooped without the top skin to hold it up. Samuel ran from body to body in the gathering twilight until at last there were no more bodies to find. No matter how fast he ran, how wide he ran, he did not find his parents. Along with 6 or 7 others, they had not been killed, or at least not been killed here. They had been taken away. They had not been killed. He clung to that thought they had not been killed. He stood, his breathing ragged, sobbing softly. Twice he had thrown up, and the smell and taste mixed with the tears of frustration and grief for his friends, and rage for what had been done to them. He knew that if he lived to be 100, he would never lose the taste, the smell or the images of what he had seen, the madness of what men could do to other men in savage rage. Dark caught him now. He had circled through the settlement and was back at his own cabin, or where it had been. There was nothing left that would furnish light, all of the candles had melted. But he trapped some of the embers that were still glowing and made a campfire off from the cabin a bit. In its light he found the woodpile, which, oddly, had not been burned, and at the side of the pile there was a stack of pine pitch knots and roots that his mother had used to start fires. The pitch concentrated in the knots burned with a smoky hot flame that lasted for an hour or more and would work as a torch. Near the garden plot he found the oak shovel they had used to turn the earth for gardening. The attackers had overlooked it or left it as useless, because anything of value had been taken or destroyed. There were 9 bodies to be buried before the coyotes, wolves and bear came. He knew that he would be moving come daylight, tracking, looking for sign, so the burying had to be done tonight. Carrying spare pine knots and the shovel, he went from body to body. He dug a shallow grave next to each one, knowing that it might not be enough to protect them, that scavengers might dig them up, but so pressed for time that he had no choice. He covered each as best he could. 3 were children and did not take as long, and though it was hard to tell exactly who they were in the dark and with the condition of the bodies, he remembered the children laughing and playing in front of the Olafsons' cabin, 2 boys and a little girl with a crude doll. He found the doll in the grass and wept as he buried it with the smallest body. He cried over each corpse, thinking of them living, thinking of them meeting in the cabin and living and talking and laughing and just being. And now all gone. Gone. He could not stop crying, thinking of his parents, wondering, worrying. It took 5 hours to bury everyone. It was still dark when he finished and looked around him. Then he realized that he should have said something over the bodies. He did not know the right words, something about ashes and dust, but he took another torch and went back to each grave and bowed his head and said, "Please, Lord, take them with you. Please." It was all he could think to say, and he hoped it was enough. He went back to the campfire by his own cabin site and sat looking into the flames. Praying for safety for his parents. And the others who had not been killed, praying for all who survived, but praying most for his parents and, squatting there by the fire, also praying for daylight to come so he could begin looking for them. And in half an hour, a little more, his eyes closed and sleep came and took him down, until he was lying on his side by the fire, sleeping deeply with all the bad dreams that had known would come, sleeping with twitches and jerks and whimpers at first, and then just sleeping. Sleep. The Americans. The American Army consisted of three parts: the Continental, or Regulate, Army, the Volunteer Militia, including the elite Minutemen, and the Rangers, or small groups that were trained in guerrilla tactics. The Continentals bore the brunt of the fighting, and they were equipped much like the British, with smoothbore Brown Bess muskets and sometimes bayonets. Many of them also carried tomahawks, or small hand axes, which could be very effective once past the first line, the line of bayonets. The militia volunteers were usually used to supplement the Continentals, but were quite often not as dependable or steady as they could have been had they been trained better, and they often evaporated after receiving the first volley and before the bayonets came. Most of them were also issued smoothbore muskets, and some had bayonets for them, but others had rifles, which were very effective at long range but could not mount bayonets. Special ranger groups, such as Morgan's Rifles, had an effect far past their numbers because of the rifles they carried. A rifle, by definition, has a series of spiral grooves down the inside of the barrel with the low pressure of black powder. The rifling then was with a slow twist, grooved with a turn of about one rotation for 35 or 40 inches. A patched ball was gripped tightly in the bore, and the grooved rifling, and the long bore, up to 40 inches, enabled a larger powder charge, which allowed the ball to achieve a much higher velocity, more than twice that of the smoothbores. And the high rate of rotation, or spin, stabilized the ball flight, resulting in greater accuracy. Chapter 5. Amuel was just 13, but he lived on a Frenty share even when teenos were normal. Someone his age was 13 going on 30. Childhood ended when it was possible to help with chores. For a healthy boy or girl, it ended at 8 or 9, possibly 10. Because of his parents' nature, their lack of physical toil and on Orty wonder in M could about the whole wide world, but not necessarily the world right around them. Samuel had become provider for his family. As he embraced the forest, his skill at hunting grew. Actually, the forest embraced him, took him in, made him, as the French said, a coureur du bois, a woods runner. Soon he provided meat for nearly the whole settlement, and in turn, the other men and women helped Samuel's parents with their small farm and took over Samuel's chores when he was in the woods. Samuel's knowledge grew until when he heard a twig break, he would know whether it was a deer or bear or squirrel that broke it. He could look at a track and know when the animal or man made it, and whether or not the creature was in a hurry, and if so, why, and how fast it was going and what, if anything, was chasing it and how close the pursuer might be. And the more he was of the woods, of the wild, of the green, the less he was of the people. He sometimes enjoyed being with others, and of course he loved his parents. But his skills and his woods knowledge set him apart, made him different. His neighbors in the settlement saw this, and they sought him out when they had a question about the forest or about game. They marveled at him, thought of him as a kind of seer, one who could know more than others, divine things in a spiritual way. Samuel knew this was not the case. He had just learned to see what others could not. Now he brought to the fore all his knowledge to read sign as he met the day. He was on his feet before the first light broke through the trees. He woke desperately thirsty and went to the creek that trickled past the rear of the cabin, and he drank long and hard. The water was so cold it hurt his teeth, and so sweet it took some of the taste stink from the evening before out of his mouth. He was hungry, but he could find no food that the marauders had overlooked. He would have to shoot something along the way. For now, there was nothing to do but read sign and try to figure out what had happened, how it had happened, and exactly when. He started by circling the cabin, forcing himself to take time to be calm, carefully studying the ground, looking closely at the soft dirt away from the grass. First he found small tracks from moccasins he had made for his mother. Then he saw his father's prints, also from moccasins, the right foot toed in slightly from a time when, showing off as a small boy, had broken his ankle jumping from a shed roof. Both sets of prints were in the soft dirt in front of the door of the cabin, in the normal patterns they would make going in and out. Then, in the dirt at the side of the cabin, more moccasin prints. Larger, flatter feet, digging deeper, running, as the attackers came. And still more prints, too many to tell them apart. On top of those, which meant they had come later, hard shoes with leather soles and heels. At least 3 men with regular shoes, 2 of normal weight and 1 heavier. On top of all the marks, Samuel saw horse prints. 2, maybe 3 horses, all unshod and being led, because there was no extra weight on them. No men in the settlement wore shoes, or could afford horses to ride. Only 1 man had a single workhorse. Others who could afford animals had oxen, because when they became too old or broken to work, they could be eaten. The attack had been fast. They had come up along the creek. Samuel backtracked and found their prints in the soft soil there and exploded out in the clearing by the cabin. His parents were probably outside and must have been overrun with no time to react. His father wouldn't have had his musket close anyway. It was like him to leave it inside when working near the house. Samuel's father had seen bad things happen to other people, but was too good inside, too generous, to believe that they could happen to him. He must believe now, Samuel thought. The attack widened rapidly. He saw where Overton and others had fallen, saw the blood, now covered with flies, where they had been hacked to the ground with tomahawks. It was a mystery to Samuel, though, why his parents had not been killed. He was grateful, but it didn't make any sense. He lost their tracks as he followed the spreading attack. Larger moccasin prints and the shoe prints of the 3 men were everywhere. He could imagine the terror of the people in the settlement, the war cries of the attackers mixed with the screams of the victims and the smell of blood and fear and death. He saw where at least 2 of the men in shoes had mounted their horses. Here and there he found single or double tracks of his mother and father as they were jerked or pulled, the tracks scuffed and misshapen. New tracks joined theirs as other people were also spared, all of them dragged or pushed toward the eastern side of the settlement. Finally he saw how it had ended. The last of the cabins were burned, the surviving victims probably neck-tied to each other with rope lined up and pulled along the trail. The horses were in front and the attackers split, some in front and some in back. There was no indication that any prisoners had been wounded or killed. When had it happened? He started following the tracks which a blind man could have followed and let his mind work on that question. Had left home early the day before, moving west until he came to new country, since he'd hunted out the forest around the settlement. Say by mid-morning he was out of earshot of gunfire if anybody had used a gun. All the victims he'd buried had been chopped down with either tomahawks or war clubs. So, the attack could have come mid-morning. That would have been the soonest. If that was the case, then they were just under 24 hours ahead of him. Maybe 20, 22. Moving slowly as they would with prisoners, they might make 2 miles an hour. With a rest of perhaps 6 hours, they might have traveled 14 to 16 hours. 24 to 28 miles. He shook his head. Probably less. He studied the trail ahead and the spacing of the footprints, trying to estimate their speed. They were close together. Even the horses' tracks showed they were moving slowly. 20 miles, at the most, yet still only a guess. But he turned out to be wrong. Later he discovered that he'd forgotten that there was another settlement of 4 cabins 10 miles farther on. And the attackers had taken the time to stop and slaughter the people who lived there. The British. Generally poorly trained, the British enlisted soldier was also poorly paid, often going months with no pay at all, poorly cared for. The wounded were virtually ignored and allowed to die alone, unless a friend had time to help, poorly fed, salt beef, dried peas and tea were mainstays, and poorly treated, tied to a wagon wheel and flogged until his back was shredded for the slightest infraction. And yet somehow, amazingly, up until the War for Independence he managed to conquer most of the world. Young British officers in England, when they were being shipped out to fight in the colonies, were told to settle your affairs and make out a proper will because the rifleman will almost certainly kill you. Chapter 6. She walked. Samuel felt as if he were following some kind of a killing storm. Even the tracks seemed savage. From the footprints, it was evident that the prisoners, tied together, were constantly jerked and pulled to increase their speed. Their prints were scuffed, ragged, and he felt his mother's anguish terribly. She was small and thin and very strong in her own way, but this brutal treatment, probably with a rope around her neck, might be too much for her. If she was too slow, they might. He could not finish the thought. The shock Samuel had felt since he'd come upon the devastation in the settlement and dealt with the bodies had left him numb. Now it turned to anger, coming into rage, and that was worse because he had to remain calm. He had no idea what to do except to follow his parents' acts. He saw their footprints now and then. He had to follow and rescue them. How he could do that, free his parents, he'd have to wait and see. Wait until he knew more. He would learn by studying sign. He could not forget himself and his skills now. The people who were leaving the tracks were the people he had to deal with. He had to understand them by the time he caught up with them. He stopped and tried to slow his harsh breathing, tried to still his mind and remember all he had taught himself about studying trails and the surrounding ground. It seemed that all of the captors and captives were walking on the trail, but there might be others off to the side. Quickly, he started to swing to the left and right of the trail. It was mostly grass, and hard to read, but at last he saw scuff marks and some moccasin tracks in open dirt. They had scouts on each side of the main group. On the second swing, he found the first body. It was a man in his 30s who'd been picking berries when they'd come upon him. He must have had a rifle or musket. No one would be out in the woods without some kind of weapon, but it was gone, along with his powder horn and possibles bag. He had been scalped. Mutilated. Sadly, there was no time for Samuel to give him a decent grave. He scraped a slight trench with his knife and covered the body with a minimum of dirt. He bowed his head, then went back to the trail. Covering the body hadn't taken much time, but it upset him. As he walked on, he tried to still the shaking of his hands. He picked up his speed and came into the clearing of the next settlement before he was ready for it. He thought he knew what he would find. It was just the few cabins, but unlike Samuel's home, it had a name, Draper's Crossing. And it was gone. At first it seemed the same devastation he had found at home. Smoke rising from burned cabins and sheds. But when he stopped, he saw that he wasn't alone. On the southern side of the clearing, there was a figure. It was an old man. As Samuel approached, he saw that the man was spading dirt with a wooden shovel onto a mound that was clearly a grave. And he was singing. Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Samuel stopped 10 yards away. He saw no weapon, but he stood ready, rifle held across his chest, thumb on the hammer. As the old man patted the dirt with the shovel, Samuel could see 4 other grave mounds where the cabins had been. The man said in a sing-song voice, "They're to sleepy, little darling, they're to sleepy with the Jesus boy, all to sleepy, little darling, all to sleepy with the Jesus boy." Samuel coughed, but the old man did not turn. Jesus came, the Jesus boy came and took them all up to heaven. How long ago were they here? Samuel finally interrupted the man's song. The man turned toward Samuel and kept up his singing. Lordy, then the Jesus boy came and took them all to heaven. There was Draper and Molly and they came in and took them all to the Jesus boy. How long ago? Can you tell me when they were here? In the dark they came. Took them all to the Jesus boy, took them all but not old Bobby. No sir, didn't take old Bobby, 'cause old Bobby he sat eating dirt and pointing up at the Jesus boy and talking through his ear holes, and they thinking old Bobby was Teched, but it wasn't so. Water. Is there water or food here? Wasn't Teched at all, just knew how the Jesus boy could save us, so I sat there eating dirt and laughing and praying. With piercing, intense and otherworldly green eyes, he stared, but not at Samuel. He looked through Samuel at some far place that only he could see, only he could know. He picked up the shovel and started walking off to the south where Samuel could see one more burned cabin. Beside it lay what looked like a pile of rags, but Samuel knew it wasn't. One more body. Now he remembered something he had heard about the Indians. Considering that he had lived his whole life on the frontier, he knew very little about them, and what he did know he had learned by listening to adults, to rumors and stories they sometimes told after they'd had a little too much hard cider or blackstrap rum. He remembered that some tribes saw crazy people as graced by the higher power, and that they believed that old people who did not think straight should be protected, or at least not harmed. Which must be why they had let old Bobby go. "Maybe he is crazy," Samuel said aloud, watching him walk away with the shovel. "And maybe not. Either way, he's alive." He turned back to the trail. If old Bobby was right, they had come in the dark. Probably just before dawn, if they had stopped to rest at all. That meant Samuel was gaining. And that meant he had to keep moving. The war for independence very rapidly turned into something like a world war. Native Americans fought on both sides, and Spain got involved on the American side, or at least its navy did. Germany sent the mercenaries known as Hessians. The French were a staunch ally of the United States, with their navy keeping England from resupplying her troops and distracting it from the American navy. The English navy, in fact, was so preoccupied with the French that it could not focus on the American problem. Chapter 7 had been running for 40 hours now. Just as H left Draper's Crossing, he passed a cornfield that the attackers had tried to burn. Some ears of corn had been roasted. Hunger took him like a wolf and he grabbed a half-dozen ears, jamming them in his clothing. He ate as he walked, letting the sweet corn juice slide down his throat and into his stomach. The hunger was so intense that eating the corn made his jaws ache. The food made his body demand water. He hadn't taken time to find a well or where one was. When he came to a small creek, he stopped to drink. The water was muddy where the creek crossed the trail, so he moved off into the thick underbrush 20 yards upstream to where the creek ran clear. He knelt to put his mouth to the water and this act saved his life. His lips had no sooner touched the water than he heard men's voices. It was a native tongue and they were loud, and laughing. There were 2 of them. Had they come upon Samuel, they surely would have taken or killed him. Samuel kept his head near the ground. Through small holes in the brush he could see them from the waist down. They wore leather leggings and high moccasins in each gangs and High carried a musket in one hand. He could see the butts hanging down at their sides and either a acoustic or a killing lance in the other. Both of the men had fresh scalps hanging on the shafts they carried. For the first time in his life Samuel wanted to kill a man. The overwhelming rage that he had begun to feel while following his mother's small footprints as she'd been savagely jerked along the trail was like a hot knife in his brain. If there had only been one, he would have done it. But he carried no tomahawk. All he had was a skinning knife, and his rifle fired only one shot. After that, the one he didn't shoot would turn on him before he could reload. With only a knife to defend himself, he'd have almost no chance. So he waited until they were out of sight, then, staying low and moving slowly, he went back to the trail. Why had the men come back? Whatever the reason, 2 men alone would not backtrack too far into potentially hostile country. If there were any kind of force after them, they would want to keep moving. So, Samuel thought maybe I'm getting close. He picked up the pace to a jog, but stayed well to the side of the trail on the edge of the thicker undergrowth in case he ran into any others. And again, this move saved his life. Clearings left by old beaver ponds were scattered through the forest. Some were small, an acre or 2, others were 30 or 40 acres. A large clearing popped up in front of Samuel now. It was late afternoon, almost evening, and the sun slanted from the west behind him into the clearing. It was another stroke of luck. The clearing had been turned into a large encampment, filled with Indians, some British soldiers in red uniforms and, nearly a quarter of a mile away, freight wagons hooked up to horses. Samuel slid into the underbrush. He crawled farther back where he couldn't be seen. Unfortunately he couldn't see either, and he squatted in the thick foliage and tried to remember what he'd seen. 3 wagons ready to go out. 10 or 15 soldiers, including 3 officers on horses, and 10 or 15 Indians. He shook his head. No. Not so many soldiers. 7 or 8. And fewer Indians. 8 or 9. One large fire in the center of the clearing, one smaller one closer to the wagons. A group of people huddled there. The captives. There hadn't been time to see them clearly, and they were too far away for him to see if his mother and father were in the group. In a rope pen near the wagons were 1 or 2 horses, 3 or 4 oxen, maybe a milk cow. There was also a spit set up over the larger fire with some kind of big animal cooking. Which meant they were going to be here for some time, perhaps the night. He settled slowly back on his haunches, careful not to move the brush around him. He had caught up to them. There was a chance his mother and father were with that group of captives. He still had no plan to rescue them. Everything he'd done was just to catch up, see if they were still alive. Could they be here? He hadn't come across their bodies on the trail, and there were captives by the fire. For the moment, that was enough. The plan would come later. It would be dark soon, there was still no moon. Now he was astonished that it had only been 40 or so hours since Had returned from the hunt. His whole life, everything in it and around it, was different now, torn and gutted and forever changed from all that it had been, and it would never be the same. It would be dark soon. And in the dark, he thought, with no moon, in the near pitch dark of starlight, there might be possibilities. He had no plan. But it would be dark soon. And just then, as he settled back to wait and think on some way to get to the captives without being discovered, the whole world blew up. Warfare. The British procedure when fighting was to march at the foe in a close line, with 2 or 3 ranks of men. The front rank would fire at 50 or 60 yards, then drop back and reload while the second rank stepped forward and fired, dropping back and reloading while the back rank came forward and fired. This rolling volley had the effect of creating a kind of mass firepower. The weapons were very simple, but it was almost impossible to stand against the line when the men grew close, quit firing altogether and charged, screaming. It took a special kind of courage to stand ready when a line of howling men ran at you with bayonets aimed at your stomach. Many times, American soldiers turned and ran rather than face what the British Army called the Wall of British Steel. Chapter 8. The natives began whooping and dancing around the large campfire, firing their muskets in the air in celebration. Samuel crept out, slowly, until he could partially see what was going on. He started to move back under cover when there was a sudden increase in the racket. And the sound was different. The Indians had been firing in the air as they danced, which caused the explosions to go up and away. They were firing smoothbore muskets, weapons that made a muffled barking sound. But this new sound had the sharper, cracking quality of higher velocity rifles. Samuel crept back out to the edge and saw that the shots had come from the north side of the clearing, where another trail came in. 6 or 8 shots. Great clouds of black powder smoke came rolling out of the forest. A pause to reload, then 8 more shots. The Indians and British soldiers were stunned. A few Indians and 1 soldier went down, probably dead. Several others were wounded and hobbled into the brush for cover. But the Indians and British recovered and returned fire. Samuel was jarred by 2 important facts. First, whoever was attacking, this might end in the rescue of his parents. Second, he should help them. He moved to the clearing near the trail, raised his rifle, cocked it and, without thinking of the enormity of what he was doing, aimed at the nearest British soldier. He was front sight settled on the red uniform. He set the first trigger and was moving his finger to the hair trigger when he heard a noise behind him. He wheeled, his rifle coming around in time for him to see the 2 Indians who had nearly caught him earlier, running straight at him. Half a word, then one Indian, the one farther away, leveled his musket and fired. Samuel felt the ball graze his cheek. Without thinking, his rifle at his hip, he touched the hair trigger and, in slow motion, felt the rifle buck, saw the small hole appear in the Indian's chest. Then, through a cloud of smoke from his weapon, he watched the Indian fall as he saw the other Indian swing a tomahawk in a wide arc. He knew he couldn't raise his rifle in time to block the blow. The tomahawk was coming at his head and he tried to duck, but the white-hot pain exploded as the side of the tomahawk smashed into his forehead. And then, nothing. Wounds. Untreated battle injuries often led to gangrene, which causes the body to literally rot away, turning first green, then black, from infection that travels rapidly. Because antibiotics were unavailable in the 18th century, amputation was the usual treatment. Due to the horrific odor of gangrene, surgeons could smell the patient and make an accurate diagnosis. If the patient was not lucky enough to benefit from amputation, maggots would be introduced into the wound in an attempt to aid healing. They would eat away the infection. Barring the surgical removal of body parts or the use of parasites, doing absolutely nothing and letting the patient die was the only option at the time. Chapter 9. Strange Dreams, Visions of Unreality. Endless screams that started with low grunts and became more and more shrill until they cut his soul. Dreams of his mother, dressed all in buckskins, ladling some kind of thick stew with a wooden spoon into a wooden bowl, chewing tobacco and spitting off to the side while she held the bowl out, shaking her head. He ain't anywhere near right yet. She spit her wad of tobacco juice out again. Brains scrambled to hell and gone. Then a trapdoor came down, a lid, something thick and dark, and there was no light at all, just blessed darkness and sleep, 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 and more screams. No sense of time. Once he tried to remember his name and fought with it for a minute or a day or a week or 10 years. He couldn't tell. More dreams. Scattered. His mother, this time wrapped in a blanket with stringy black hair hanging down at the sides of her head while she chewed an obnoxious cud. She disgorged it, slapped it on his head and tied it on with a filthy rag, spitting more tobacco juice out and nodding. Got to get the poison out or she's going to rot on him. It was as if his eyes never really opened, as if he saw everything through closed lids, and the images that swirled through his mind were so mixed that they became a blur. Night, daylight and darkness seemed to aop and flow over each other. Pictures would stick for a moment and then go. A horse, then a cow, then his mother leaning down, still in the dirty blanket, greasy black hair hanging down the sides of her head, raising the poultice and grinning, spitting more tobacco juice. Coming clean now, she said, clear pus, looks clean as spring water, all the yeller gone. And then bouncing, incredibly rough bouncing, as if someone were jumping on a bed while he was trying to sleep. He would pass out in pain, rolling waves of pain. Finally a picture stopped, just stopped in front of his eyes, in front of his mind. Locked in. Eyes, in a dark, or night, and he was on some kind or wooden frame lying on the ground. A fire burned nearby and when he opened his eyes wide, the light from the fire seemed to shove a lance into the middle of his head. He grunted in pain. He closed his eyes and waited for the rolling pictures to begin again. When they didn't, he opened his eyes, but only in a slit. The image was the same. A bed frame of some kind, a fire, and this time, less pain from the light. As he watched, an arm came out of nowhere and put a piece of wood on the fire, then withdrew. He tried to move his head and see where the arm went, but the pain was so intense he nearly lost consciousness. He lay back and closed his eyes, opened them again when the pain receded. Where? Who? The words pealed in his mind like a bell, echoing around inside his head. A figure appeared next to the fire. Not his mother but a young man with stringy black hair and a cheek full of tobacco juice. He leaned down, his face close to Samuel's. You in there righteous or are you going away again? TM. I'm here. Who are you? John. John Cooper, but most just call me Co-op. Where? Long story, that. We be about 12 miles from where you got that egg on your head. 12 miles in distance, more than that in time. When? I don't remember. Some Indians. I think I shot at one and then, nothing. Why did I shoot at an Indian? Can't tell. We come on these Iroquois and some redcoats. We'd already seen what they took and done back at Miller's Crossing, so we snuck up proper and took them on. I remember. You were shooting. You say we, where are the others? Asleep. I'm the night watch tonight, plus I've been doctoring you and I thought you might lose your light during the night. You been breathing like an old pump. I guess you was just sucking air hard because you didn't die. Course it could still happen. I had a cousin got kicked in the head by a mule days fractious mules and he lived for nigh on 2 months 'fore he lost his light. He never talked to none except now and again a kind of moan like somebody stepping on a duck. Then he just up and died. Samuel closed his eyes, fell to spinning. Then, as if a fog were lifted, it all came back. I was tracking Ma and Pa. I mean the redcoats, the Indians, hit our place while I was looking for Bear. They killed most everybody but took my parents and a few others captive. Coop nodded. We saw them all around a fire. Ropes tying 'em together. What happened to them? Coop shrugged. Wasn't much of a fight. We fired once, reloaded, laid out another round, and they ran. Them redcoats had wagons already hooked up and they piled the captives in the wagons and lit out. We couldn't shoot no more for fear of hitting the captives. The Indians just drifted away, like smoke. That would have been that except one of them put a musket ball in Paul. It was in his gut-awful place, that. We knew he was going to die ain't nobody comes back from a belly wound and kept waiting for it, but he made 4 days. He gave up his light last night. No, night before. Died screaming. It was bad surprised it didn't bring you out of your stupor, the screaming. Kept everybody up all night. Samuel closed his eyes again, trying to put numbers together. Died 2 days ago, after making 4 days, if a belly wound took 4 days to kill and it happened the day of the fight but Paul died 2 days ago. How long since they took the captives? Since the fight? 5, 6 days. You been out 6 days. We like to not found you and when we did, we almost left you. Thought you was with the raiders. Me? Why? Well, you wasn't with us, so we thought you was with them. But Carl did some thinking on it. Carl's my brother and he's the one to think on things and said look how messed up your head was where they clubbed you and look at the bullet hole in the Indian you killed. That's a honey of a little rifle you got and how could you be with them and still get clubbed and shoot one of them, so we took you with us. I've been out 6 days? Closer to 7, counting the night. And did you say we'd come 12 miles? Coop nodded. First 3 days no, 'fore we let you to lay. Everybody thought you would die and there washy no sense dragging you. Then there was Paul, with his belly wound. If we tried to move him he would scream like a panther. Then we rigged up a drag and started to pull you back of one of the moccasins they left behind when they ran. All the bumping. Coop nodded, spit tobacco juice in the fire and listened to it hiss. We couldn't stay too long and thought you could die just as well dragging as you could laying up somewhere. If we'd left you, something would have come along and ate you, so, here you are. My head. Coop nodded. Good cut from that hawk. Carl took some deer sinew he had and an old needle he carries for fixings and sewed it up right pert. He said in case you lived wouldn't be much of a scar. Across your forehead. Coop smiled and with some pride added, it come on to having green pus and everybody knows that's bad, so I made up a spit and bocce poultice and tied it on with a piece of rag. Pus cleared up in 2 days. So I've been laying for 6 days? Another nod. Coming on 7. Well, how? With a start, Samuel realized he didn't have any pants on underneath the coarse blanket that covered him. How come I'm not all messed up? We took your pants off. Got them wrapped in a blanket pack with your rifle. Indian must have been in a hurry or he would have took it, sweet little shooter like that. Also got your possibles bag and powder horn. What you feel under your rear is fresh grass. Anytime you messed we just threw the old grass away and pulled in a half a foot of fresh new grass. Slick as a new calf, or maybe slick as a baby's bottom. Maybe I should put my leggings on, only if you ain't going out of your head again. I don't think so. Suits me. I was the one having to get new grass all the time. You ain't eating nothing other than a little broth I got down you one time and some water now and again. Man can go long time without food, no time at all without he has some water. I'm starving, Samuel said automatically, but with the words came the feeling and he realized he was as hungry as had ever been. You'd ought to drink something soft first. Coop handed him a wooden bowl with a mixture of broth and meat. Go slow. This is from some salted ox they was cooking when we jumped them. Samuel took the bowl. He tried to drink slowly, but as the taste and smell hit him he couldn't help gulping at it, meat and all, so fast that he gagged and threw up. Slow, Coop repeated, coming back with a blanket roll and putting it on the ground next to Samuel. You'll founder, you don't go slow. Samuel started over carefully. There was silence as he ate, chewing completely before swallowing, small bites, small swallows. It's like fire, he thought, when you're cold. Fire moving through your body. He ate the first bowl, handed it to Coop and watched him refill it, this time with broth and chunks of glistening fat as well as meat. This second bowl he drank and ate more slowly than the first, and while he ate he made a mental list of questions to ask when his stomach was full. Why are you here? How many of you are there? Where are you going? Is there any way you can help me find my mother and father? Are you, will you, can you, do you, questions roaring through his mind. He finished eating. He lay back. He opened his mouth to ask the first question and his eyes closed at the same instant and he was immediately asleep. And the last thing he thought as he went under was that he still hadn't put his pants on. American spirit. Although poorly trained and weakly led and improperly fed so badly that soldiers sometimes had to eat their shoes, the Americans took comfort from fighting on home soil and usually had much higher morale than the British. While they were often outnumbered and fought with inferior equipment, this spirit had an enormous effect and they took the phrase morale is to fighting as 4 is to 1 to heart on the battlefields. Chapter 10. This time the sounds of men coughing and axes chopped by pine wood for the fire awakened Samuel. He opened his eyes, the pain was much less and saw that it was daybreak. Men were moving all around him. He started to roll, but the head pain stopped him, as well as the sudden memory that he had no pants on. The bedroll was next to him where Coop had put it. He snaked his pants out, pulled them on and fastened them with the leather cord around the waist. The pain in his head had abated, it only jabbed if he moved suddenly. The wound felt tight, as if someone were pulling the top of his scalp together. When he unrolled the blanket, his rifle half fell out and he saw that the lock had dirt jammed around the flint and pan, pushing up the striker plate, or frizzen, so the rifle was not able to fire. The men were making fire, tying bedrolls. One man had what looked to be a permanently bent left arm held up at a slight angle. He was sitting on the ground cleaning his rifle. It made Samuel feel embarrassed that his own lock was so dirty. He found his possibles bag in the blanket roll. This was a pouch with the powder horn attached that hung around his neck, where he carried odds and ends of equipment for cleaning and firing his rifle. Inside, he had a tiny piece of steel wire. After blowing the dirt out of the pan and frizzen and flint, he used the wire to clear the touch hole, which fed the jet of flame from the pan into the powder charge. Then he used an oily rag to clean the whole area and put some finely ground black powder into the pan. This was the ignition powder that the flint metal sparks would fire into the powder charge. He closed the frizzen over the pan, eased the hammer to half-cock, safety, and set the rifle aside. The fire had flared up as the men added wood. Samuel rose to his feet and went into the nearby bushes to relieve himself. His legs were wobbly but seemed to work well enough, even though he felt weak as a kitten. As one part of his body got better, another would follow. As the pain in his head went down, the hunger in his belly came up. There was the entire back leg from an ox over the fire on a metal spit. Last night Coop had been cutting bits of it to put in Samuel's broth. Looking at it made Samuel even more ravenous. The other men weren't eating, so he held back. One, a thin man with a scraggly beard, saw Samuel looking at the meat. He pulled a knife, really a short sword, carved of a generous piece and handed it to Samuel. "You got to eat. We might walk long today and it's going to be hard for you to keep up without your belly is full." "Thank you." Samuel took the meat. It was very tough and he sat chewing and swallowing, watching the men clear up camp. While Samuel watched the men and ate, he also rolled and tied up his bedroll, making certain his powder was dry and his possibles bag was ready to go. But these men were even faster. Without speaking except to grunt and point, they seemed to get everything done with the least effort and in the quickest time. The ox was yoked and tied off to a tree. The skid that Samuel had been on, which had two long tongues that went up either side of the ox and attached to the yoke, was hooked up and packed with extra equipment: the cooking pot, blankets, muskets, a small keg of powder and another of whiskey, and, of all things, a drum left by the fleeing redcoats and Indians. Then the men came and stood by the fire. In silence, they cut pieces of meat and ate, drinking creek water out of a wooden bucket with a wooden dipper. Samuel still had dozens of questions, but since the men were silent as they stood staring into the fire while they chewed, he held his tongue. There were 7 men. When everybody was done eating, they each took a plug of tobacco and poked it in their cheek or lower jaw. They put the leftover meat on the skid, wrapped in a piece of green ox hide to keep the flies off, then used the bucket to fetch water from the creek to put the fire out. With no effort at all, they were moving along the trail. 2 men went well ahead, 1 left, 1 right of the trail. The rest formed a column. If 5 men could be called a column, just ahead of the ox and Samuel. In Samuel's weakened condition, there was absolutely no way he could have kept up with the men. But the ox saved him. He knew that oxen tend to plod a little less than 2 miles an hour, and this ox was slower yet. Even Samuel had no trouble keeping up with him, and when his legs felt a little weak, he would move to the ox's side and hold onto the yoke, letting the ox pull him along for a time. Every hour and a half the 2 men walking ahead would come in and 2 others would move out. On one of these cycles, Coop came back and walked near Samuel. It was what Samuel had been waiting for. "You kept me alive." "Thank you." "It weren't much. A little tobacco and spit and tough meat. I'd have been done if you hadn't come along." "Maybe. Maybe not. One never knows how a wind is going to blow." "Why did you all come along? Where are you going?" Coop spit. The men all spit, almost all the time. Samuel had once tried tobacco, first in a clay pipe, then taking a chew, and it had made him sick as a dog. He couldn't see the sense in using it, but all these men seemed to chew all the time. And spit like fountains. Maybe something happened to your taster when you got older, he thought, so you didn't mind it. "We're going to join up," Coop said, pointing east with his chin, "and fight them redcoats. There be a feller named Morgan round about Boston City starting up Morgan's Rifles. We all shoot rifles and we figure to give them redcoats a taste of good shooting. They got nothing but muscats, good for nothing after 50, 60 yards. Carl," here he pointed up to where his brother walked beside the head of the ox dash, "he can pink a man on a horse out to 200-300 yards. Every time. Wouldn't even know what hit him, nor where it come from." He nodded his chin at the group. Every man here can hit a foot-square piece of paper every time at 200 yards. I suppose you could, too, took a mind to it. Why I'm not sure about killing. You did that Indian back there. Laying dead and had a bullet hole in him. I wasn't aiming. He shot and I pulled the trigger. What you gonna do when you find your mam and pap? Shake hands with them that took em? Samuel felt like spitting, too. I haven't thought that far yet. Best be thinking on it and keep your powder dry and your pan primed. Right. Thing is, I didn't even know there was anybody to fight. Who was good or bad, which side to be on? Coop snorted. Don't take much thinkin'. Them that starts into killing people for no reason, them that comes and takes your folks with a rope around their necks, they's the bad ones. Your good people don't do that. What reason? Samuel stumbled on a rock. To his surprise, the ox was aware of it and hesitated to let him catch up. Why did those British redcoats and Indians attack us like that? There was no reason. We weren't against the crown or rebels or anything. Coop spit, neatly taking a fly off the ox's ear. He snorted. Redcoats doing it because they's redcoats and ain't worth a tinker's damn. Follerin' orders. Indians doing it because they was hired to do it. They's Iroquois, most of 'em work for the English, always have, always will. Ever since that French war. They get all the plunder they can carry and scalp money from the redcoats. Heard there's a man named Hamlin, some kind of redcoat officer, buys so many scalps they call him Hair Buyer Hamlin. What I don't understand is why they took your folks instead of killin'. Oh look, the front line is comin' in. The column stopped by a Clearwater Creek and everybody drank. Then the men took the meat off the drag and sat in a circle cutting pieces and chewing. At first Samuel hung back, but Carl motioned him to squat and eat. Samuel was feeling stronger by the minute and the maya heated him like fire. No one talked much except for Coop, and when they finished, they rose, took a chew of tobacco and set off. Coop and another man went ahead. Samuel walked in silence, hanging onto the wooden shaft tied to the ox. It was mid-morning and the sun fell through tall trees on either side of the trail, so they seemed to be walking in a lighted green tunnel. Now and then insects caught sunlight and flashed white like small lamps. Any other time, Samuel would have been taken by the beauty of it. But now he could not stop thinking of what Coop had started to say. Why hadn't the raiders killed his parents? And would they do it now? I'm way behind them, he thought, 6, maybe 7 days. Dragging along with an ox. God only knows what's happening to them. I have to go faster. The Hessians. The British also used mercenary soldiers, issued with the same brown Bess musket and bayonet. Most of them were troops from Germany, called Hessians. While they were relatively effective as combat soldiers, they brought with them such savage, atrocious behavior, and committed war crimes so far outside civilized behavior, bayoneting unarmed captive soldiers who had surrendered, farmers, women, including pregnant women, children and even infants, that they became known as little more than beasts and were treated in kind. Chapter 11. He lay under overhanging hazel brush and studied the farm here, very close to the middle of the wild, was an almost perfect little farm. It had been 3 days since Samuel left the men behind. He'd eaten more and more meat, become stronger and stronger, and, at last, couldn't stand the slowness of walking beside the ox. The men were in no particular hurry, or, as Coop said, still gonna be a war, catch it now or catch it later. And they had gear to move, so had to go slowly. But Samuel became more frantic with every step. At last, when they'd stopped to rest, he had told Coop he was going to take off on his own. Coop had nodded. "There'll be people wantin' to kill you," he said. "Well, let me cut those stitches out of your head. Healed up good." He set to work as he spoke. Almost everybody you meet will maybe want to kill you, so keep to the brush, keep your head down and don't walk where others walk. He took out the last stitch. There was nothing more to say, so, with a nod, Samuel turned away and trotted ahead of Coop and the rest of the men. Samuel took the advice to heart and worked well off the trail, which was becoming more like a road with 2 tracks. Even so, he doubled his speed. He had brought meat with him and took care to eat sparingly. After 3 days, it was nearly gone. He'd have to get more soon. Deer were as thick as fleas and it was just a matter of shooting one. He was moving quietly through the woods, ready to do just that, when he came upon the it had not been attacked and burned. It was a shock to see buildings standing and unharmed. And aside from that, this was a proper farm, not a frontier cabin hacked out of the woods. True, there was deep forest all around it, but the farm itself was neat as a pin, with split-rail fences all whitewashed in a frame house, and a barn made not from logs but from milled lumber. More, the house was painted white and the barn red, with white trim on the doors and windows. As he watched, he could see chickens in the yard. Several thoughts hit him. First, chicken would taste good. The thought of a roasted chicken made him salivate. Second, if they hadn't been attacked it must mean they were friendly to the raiders, who must have come right through here. Third, an easy jump in thinking it would be all right for Samuel to confiscate a chicken, assuming the farmer was friendly with Samuel's mortal enemy. Now, how to bring it about? He could wait until dark, but that was still at least 8 hours away. He couldn't waste time sitting here. The farm was in the middle of a large clearing. The tree line came close to the barn. If he worked his way through the trees, he might get close enough to grab a chicken and run. He was moving before he stopped thinking of it. Since he saw no people as he moved around to the clearing in back of the barn, he moved fast. He kept the barn between him and the house to block their view. In moments he stood against the barn wall not 10 feet from a small flock of chickens pecking at the ground. Just as he started to make his move, he heard a scraping sound overhead and a barn loft door opened. A little girl, 8 or 9, was looking down at him. "I saw you through a crack in the wall the whole way. You thought you was sneaking, but I saw you. You looked like a big, 2-legged deer. What's wrong with your head? How come you're running like that? What are you after? Oh, the chickens. You want a chicken, go ahead. I don't like them anyway." Samuel was so stunned he couldn't say anything, then he croaked in a whisper, "Is there anybody else here?" "They's all up the house eating. They's eating squash and it makes me puke, so I came to the loft to play with my dolls." "Go ahead, I won't tell." "Thank you. Take that big red one. She's mean. Chases me all over the yard and pecks at my toes." In for a penny, in for a pound, Samuel thought. He made a darting motion and, by luck, actually caught the big red chicken. It squawked once but he held it tight and it quieted. He started to leave, then turned. "What's your name?" "And Marie Pennyworth Clark," she said, "but everybody calls me Annie." "Well, thank you, Annie. I've got to be going now." He turned to leave, but her next words stopped him. "You look just like the man who was here, except he was older and his head wasn't all cut up." "What man?" "Some men and a woman came here, some on horses and some in a wagon." At that instant an enormous man holding a rifle came around the end of the barn. He had shoulders like a BA and his gun was pointed at Samuel's face. Samuel dropped the chicken, raised his own rifle and aimed it at the center of the man. After a second, Samuel lowered his weapon. As soon as it moved, the man dropped his. Samuel had forgotten to breathe. He took a deep breath now. "My name is Samuel," he said. "I thought a fox was in the chickens when I heard the hen squawk." The man shrugged. "Wasn't too far off." I don't steal. Samuel's face burned, but I've been on some rough trail and I got hungry. He wasn't stealing, Pa, Annie piped up. I told him to take that red one. She keeps trying to eat my toes. I never turned anybody away from my door hungry, the man said. He held out his hand. Caleb Clark, come up to the house and eat. It all seemed so natural and open that Samuel forgot his earlier suspicion that the farmer was on the enemy's side. He took the man's hand. Thank you, sir. Let's stop by the pump and wash your head first. ISA sight. Ma will have a fit. I got hit by an Indian and these men came along and sewed me up. It looks, Caleb said, smiling, like you got hit by a club and then some men stitched it up and smeared some kind of dark mud or something on it. Tobacco juice, Samuel said. And spit. They made a poultice. And it saved me. They were at the watering trough and pump. Caleb took Samuel's rifle. Samuel handed it over without thinking. Caleb held Samuel's head under the pump and started working the handle. Scrub, he said, pumping harder. Samuel winced at the pain, but went to work. Finally the wound was clean enough to suit Caleb and they went to the house. Annie followed and, sure enough, the red hen pecked at her toes. Annie yelped and scurried ahead of Samuel and Caleb to the house. Samuel had never been in anything but a cabin, most often with a dirt floor or at best a crude plank one, and Caleb's house seemed too fine, as if Samuel somehow shouldn't be allowed in, at least not without being boiled clean first. The house inside was as neat as the outside, with plastered white walls and a sugar pine board floor, polished and rubbed with beeswax. Company, Ma, Caleb said. You got another plate? Caleb's wife was quite round, with red cheeks and hair up in a bun. She had flour dust on her cheek. She pushed a bit of hair back and smiled at Samuel with the briefest of looks. She pointed at a chair that backed to the stove. Sit and eat, we just started. There were only 3 people, 4 with Samuel, but the table absolutely groaned with food. There was squash, as Annie had said, with maple sugar and butter melted in the middle. There was a roast of venison and potatoes, a loaf of bread with apple butter and some kind of jelly, and corn on the cob with melted butter dripping from the cobs. Samuel had never seen anything like it. Huge bowls of food, and a gravy tub that held at least a quart of rich brown steaming hot gravy. His stomach growled as Caleb poured him some buttermilk and they all sat. There were a fork and spoon and knife at each place. Samuel waited to see how things were done. Caleb smiled. We'll say grace. They held hands, which seemed strange. Annie was to his left. She decided that since he was there she'd sit to eat and she grabbed his hand. Caleb's big paw took his other hand and in a deep voice he rumbled, Thank you, Lord, for this food and this company. In Jesus' name, amen. And they sat to. Nobody spoke. Ma heaped his plate with food. It seemed more than he could possibly eat. He was sure his stomach had shrunk, but he somehow got it all tucked in and felt full as a tick. Then Ma brought out rhubarb pie with thick cream sprinkled with maple sugar and somehow he got that down as well. Thank you, ma'am, he said. I've never eaten like that, not in my whole life. Even at fall feast it wasn't that good, or that much. I won't have to eat for a week. I just wish my folks. He stopped, remembering what Annie had said. He turned to her. You said some men came and one of them looked like me. Caleb cut in. Some British soldiers came here with 2 wagons holding fugitives or captives. 5 of them. I fed the soldiers and they were civil enough and didn't bother us, though I heard some bad stories of the Hessians that hit some farms east of here. Then I took food and water out to the captives and one man, and his wife with him, was very polite and thanked me. He looked like you, same eyes and nose. He was my father. And that was my mother. Samuel looked down at the floor and blinked away the burning in his eyes. Annie softly patted his shoulder. He told the story of the attack, leaving out the worst details because of Annie. When he was finished, Ma was crying and he was having trouble holding tears back himself. When were they here? He asked. How long ago? 3 days. After they ate, they watered the horses, and while they were waiting for the horses to blow and settle the water, the lead officer pulled out a little traveling chessboard. I don't know how to play, but he went to the captives and your pa sat and played a game with him on the edge of the wagon. He loves chess. I heard the officer say to another soldier that the only reason he brought your father was that he saw a chessboard when they raided the cabin and he wanted somebody to play with. Thank God, Samuel thought. Thank God for such a little thing to mean so much. His father's life spared for a chessboard. His mother's life, too. He stood. Thank you for the food. I have to be going. If I'm only 3 days behind and they keep taking it slow, I could catch them. Caleb said, they're headed for New York. The city. The British hold it and they keep a lot of prisoners there in old warehouses and out in the harbor on old ships. If you don't catch them along the trail, you might just go there. Good luck to you, son. We'll keep you in our prayers. Ma pressed more food on him: venison, potatoes and corn, wrapped in a piece of linen. Annie and Ma hugged him and Caleb shook his hand. Then he trotted slowly, his stomach still heavy, out of the yard to the edge of the woods, where he entered thick forest. He stayed well off to the side of the trail. Once again, this small act saved his life. He heard one clink metal on metal and drop to his stomach, out of sight, though he could see through gaps in the brush. He watched them pass, an organized body of true with tall hats moving at a quick step in a tight formation. They followed an officer on a large bay horse. They did not look like British soldiers. They had brownish instead of red uniforms and were more disciplined than the red coats. Hessians, he thought, Germans. They were quickly past Samuel. Their march would take them directly to Caleb's farm. Curious, and with some fear, Samuel turned and followed them off to the side, 50 yards to the rear. Had relived that decision for many sleepless nights. The attack was over in minutes. The Hessians quick marched into the yard, broke formation and spread out into the farmyard, grabbing chickens as they moved. Caleb and Ma came out onto the porch. Caleb wasn't armed, though he raised his arm and pointed at the soldiers. He and Ma were immediately gunned down. Then 4 soldiers jumped to the porch and bayoneted them. Annie exploded out of the house and ran toward the barn. 3 or 4 of the soldiers shot at her but missed, and once she was around the barn she ran for the trees. More men tried to hit her but missed. Samuel was amazed at how fast she ran. She stumbled once and it looked as if she might be hit, but she jumped to her feet and kept running. They took the bodies of Caleb and Ma and dragged them back into the house. 8 or 10 men went in the house then and looted it, taking anything shiny and all the food they could find. Then they set fire to the house and barn, and when those were roaring with flames, the soldiers fell into formation and quick marched out of the yard, disappearing down the trail. It had taken less than 10 minutes. Samuel was sickened by the cruelty, the absolute viciousness, of the attack, and he hunched over and retched. He felt that he should have run to Caleb and his wife, to help in some way, but knew there was nothing he could have done. He would have been dead long before Head got at them. He was helpless. He sat crying, watching the house and barn burn, the Hessians gone like a plague. Caleb and Ma. The food, eating together, how open and gentle and pleasant and good it had been to sit with them and talk. Destroyed. Gone. Gone in this ugly war with these evil men. Gone and never coming back, and there was nothing he could do or could have done to save them, help them. Except find Annie. Take her with him to New York. He made certain nobody was coming down the trail, then set off at a trot around the clearing, staying well in the undergrowth, looking for Annie and trying to erase from his mind what he had seen. He had to find Annie. Then find his parents. That was all that mattered.